Tom Tugendhat has one of the most interesting backgrounds of any Conservative Member of Parliament. He started out life as a journalist in Beirut. Then, transitioning to the army, he became the chief advisor to David Richards, the Chief of the Defence Staff. Since then, he got elected to become a Member of Parliament in 2015, rising quickly to become the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. He's now running to be the leader of the Conservative Party after having been Security Minister for the last 2 years. This conversation focuses on his thoughts on economics and jobs of the future. Make sure you subscribe because we're hoping to interview the other candidates to be the Conservative leader throughout the autumn. Tom, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. It has become very fashionable in politics to talk about what people's fathers and parents did in politics. I'm surprised in your campaign speeches you haven't done it, but what was it like growing up with a High Court judge as a dad?
Well, mostly he wasn't. Mostly he was a lawyer, and he was doing various sort of legal cases that were of depending what they were of moderate interest. Like I don't particularly remember all the details. He did some interesting cases. He did a case on privacy, which was the Catherine Zeta-Jones Michael Douglas case against, I can't remember whether it was against Hello or OK, but anyway, it was one of those magazines, and that got quite a lot of press. But he was and he still is very prominent. He quite literally wrote the book on privacy law. It's called Privacy Law by Michael Tugendhat. So literally wrote the book. And in fact, I found out that he had left the bar and was becoming a judge while I was cleaning my rifle on the way into Alamara in 2003. We were listening to the World Service. And because that Catherine Zeta-Jones case had been so prominent, the BBC, for some reason, were covering it. And then they said that the lawyer who'd been representing Zeta-Jones and Douglas was leaving and was going to the High Court. So I remember I was looking down the barrel of my rifle, having just pulled through to clean it, when one of my mates said, "Is that your dad?" And I had to go, "Yeah, that's right," which was a slightly strange moment.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And that night we went back into combat. So it was.
And that's and what did your kind of mum do?
My mum looked after us, and she was a secretary when we were younger. She was a secretary for a publisher, and then she went back to university after that, and I'm very impressed. I'm even more impressed now. Actually, I've only got 2 kids. She had 4, and she went back to university and got a degree from Birkbeck, which with a tiny kid and a collection of teenagers cannot have been easy on time management.
Yeah, completely. But you talked about sort of lifelong learning in your leadership launch speech as well, right? So you've seen that.
It's important, isn't it? I mean, one of the things actually, everybody focuses on the combat element of the army. Actually, for most of us who've been in it, the really striking thing is the training. The army effectively trains you 1 year in 3. So you do 2 years of a job, 1 year of training, 2 years of a job, 1 year of training. I mean, that's slightly simplifying it, but you get what I mean. And it's extraordinary how much the armed forces in general invest in training their people. It's a huge investment because, of course, you cannot afford for it to go wrong when it really counts. So that investment is absolutely essential.
We'll come on to some more of that later, but just starting out in your early years and sort of, we've known each other for 10 years or so, but listening back to your various interviews and so on, I'd forgotten that you were actually a journalist first before the army. What sort of inspired that kind of move to begin with, do you think?
I was always curious about how the world works and how things happen. And I remember I was leaving university in 96 and I was looking around to start journalism. And in those days, it's probably very different now, but in those days you basically had to start on a regional paper or go abroad. And I spoke French and Arabic, so I figured I'd go abroad, and I went to Beirut and started on a paper there called the Lebanon Daily Star. It is not. Let me just be very clear. It has no connection at all to Freddie Starr Ate My Hamster or Elvis Found on the Moon or any of that sort of stuff. Yeah. It is a totally different newspaper. And it's now part of I think it's the New York Times group or something like that. But
what was the brief you were covering? What was the beat?
So I started off as a sub-editor, which I did for a few months, and then nearly a year, and then I started writing on pretty much anything. I mean, it was a small paper, right? I mean, you do everything. I found myself for a while sub-editing the sports pages. I have to say that was not my natural environment.
Forte. And so then what was the moment you thought, right?
The Lebanese are very into basketball. This is not something I was aware of before, and not a sport I've ever taken any interest in.
I'm sure it may come on. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire may come in use. And so then you decide, well, actually, I'm going to go and do the army. What was the moment that sort of led to that? Because normally people, that's not a sort of usual path, is it, to do something before?
No, it's not that unusual, actually. A lot of people join the army in their mid-20s, so they do something else first, and then they decide that actually, they'd like to do some soldiering. And for me, it was the journalism that got me into it. Actually, I'd been down on the UN line that was separating Lebanon from Israel. That sort of that so-called UNIFIL, United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, protected area. And I'd been with the Irish Battalion, who were fantastic, and various of the other sort of foreign forces that were there. And I remember thinking, I'm in the wrong business. I'm watching they're doing. And I came back to the UK and became a management consultant for a bit, thinking, time to do something grown up and serious and all the rest of it, And while I was doing that, I wanted a bit of interest in my life, and I joined the Territorial Army, the Army Reserve. And I joined thinking that what I would do would be, the sort of stuff that we were doing around the world then in 99, 2000, which was, supporting UN operations in Congo or stuff like that. But then, of course, 9/11 happened, and because I spoke Arabic, I suddenly became extremely useful. And that's when I first was mobilised and deployed to war.
You're incredibly fond of the time in the army, and you talk about it a lot. But one of the things that I wanted to sort of move on today was some of the stuff that you've talked about, the economy, because you are known as Mr. Security in many ways, right? You were in the army, you became chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee after 2 years, you then became the literal security minister as well. But actually, you've got some really interesting thoughts on the economy, and we first met discussing sort of various angel investments and sort of tax reliefs that were available to them, things like the EIS scheme. And you said in your leadership speech the other day that we need to rethink the whole of our approach to the economy. What did you sort of mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is, the reality is that what's the purpose of the economy? Right? Well, the fundamental purpose of the economy is to help us become more prosperous and happier. Right? That's it. That's pretty. Yep. You can dress it up. That's it. And how do you achieve it? Well, you achieve it by making sure that you are using the experience of the older to help the younger succeed. That's basically it, isn't it? And how do you do that? Well, there's various ways in which you do training and education, of course there are. But there's also various ways in which you share the resources, as it were, of the older with the younger so that they can succeed. And, stored up resources is just called capital. That's all it is, right? It's just a store of the knowledge, the experience and the resources that people have acquired over many years that they can then use for many things. They can use it to buy a house, or they can use it to invest in a startup, or they can do whatever they want to do with it. And connecting that better is what really interests me. And it interests me because, frankly, at the moment, we've got real frictions between that, real obstacles. Now, you're always going to have some, of course you are, right? But the question is, how do you make that connection better? Because if you make it better, what you do is you tie generations together better, so that old people get a return on their investment. They get actual growth, not the anemic growth that we've seen for 20 or so years, which is pensions, savings, whatever, growing at sort of 2-3%. You can get actual growth by tying it to the energy of young people. When you do that, you get real growth, and you get the sort of the growth that people see when they invest in startup businesses or innovation or established businesses. You get growth of 10-12%. Now, that's not just good for the older person, it's really good for the younger person as well, because it means that they have that stored up energy, as it were. You've got to think of capital like a battery, if you like. It's stored up all the energy of the person over many years that they can then deploy in different ways to power another generation or another industry or another project. And that's what I'm interested in, because the truth is, for me, being a conservative is fundamentally about that sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Belonging to a place, belonging to a community, belonging to a nation. And tying together communities is absolutely fundamental to belonging. So for me, it's about connecting people over generations, but also over geography. And again, one of the problems you've spoken about this actually is we see so much of that stored energy being stored in London, and not enough of it around the country. If you look at startups around the United Kingdom, for example, you'll see, I'm going to get the proportions wrong, but it's the vast majority in London, Then there's a bit in Bristol, another smaller bit in Manchester, and a smaller bit in Newcastle, and that's about it. Right? Now, that's not the correct distribution of talent in the UK. That's not about where people are cleverer or more entrepreneurial or whatever it is. That's just where the capital has gone. That's where the stored up energy has been plugged in to the environment. And you can see why that is. It's because of universities in Bristol and Manchester and Newcastle. It's because of the technology connections. But that can't be the only way to do it. We need to get better at plugging in that store of energy and connecting it to the entrepreneurs who need it.
I really like that, thinking about capital as battery. I think it's a really clever way of doing it. You touched on generations there, and I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's this sort of, it's becoming one of the bigger dividing lines of the UK in politics, but also in terms of the economy, of the sort of older people tend to be wealthier, etc. How do we tackle that?
Well, the reality is older people are going to be wealthier. What we've got to do is we've got to
They've had time to charge the batteries, right?
Well, exactly. They've had time to charge the batteries. And what we've got to do is make sure that what you don't see is those batteries just sort of sitting there draining slowly over time, but connected to a grid so that everybody grows. And that's where, sorry, this parallel is getting really tortured, isn't it? What you've got to do is you've got to make sure that energy is flowing, right? And the way you do that is you make sure you realise what it is that you're actually doing. Now, what government has done over many, many years is we have become more and more risk averse. And we've seen problems like Equitable Life or the Mirror Group pensions, and we've said, oh, this is really dangerous. We're going to help you. Instead of helping you to grow, we're just going to protect what you have. And so government have passed more and more regulations that protect what you have. And on one level, that sounds great, doesn't it? Because, you're protecting what you've got and you're not going to lose. But the truth is, actually you are losing, because instead of investing in young people and getting the growth from the energy that they, the ideas, the innovation, the opportunities that they've come up with, what you're doing is you're doing the old parallel of the talents from the Bible, right? You're hiding your talents in the ground, and they don't change. Well, they do actually, because inflation eats away at them over time. And so this move to greater protectionism, this move, you can see it, by the way, in the figures, in the UK, savings and pensions and insurance investment is about 3 times as much as invested in bonds and government debt than in Canada or Australia. So that's 3 times as much effectively has been frozen, if you like, been stored by protection in the UK than in Australia and Canada. And what that means is that pension growth in the UK is much slower. So pensioners are getting a less good return. Pensioners in the UK are less wealthy than they should be because they haven't got it tied into the growth of young people. Whereas in Canada and Australia, where they've understood, look, there is a risk, of course there's a risk, but you manage risk by sharing it. You manage risk by distributing that burden, by making sure that you're invested in diversified industries and economies and all the rest of it. You get the growth. And that's what I'm trying to connect. Because if you get that right, then what you do is you give older people a chance to grow their savings. But you also give younger people a chance. And one of the things that you notice in the UK is that young people find it harder to access that start-up in life. Now, you can call it, it's not just a home, but it is a home. It's to do with the capital, the energy, as it were, that they need to start in life. And that's what we need to reconnect.
Can you explain what you mean by bonds and equities and what the differences?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So basically, a bond or a debt is just a share of debt incurred, right? So if you borrow £100 and promise to pay it back at a fixed interest rate, that's a bond.
Yeah.
If you sell a share of your business, you may get the same amount for it initially. You may get £1 for the £100. It may only be 1%. But you then get a share of the return on that business. So one gives you a fixed return based on a projection of the past. The other one gives you a variable return depending on the energy of the future.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to invest, if you want to return on the ideas and innovations of the future, one's going to perform better than the other.
Yeah.
It might perform worse if the business does badly, of course, so there's risk. But if you spread out that risk over many, many different companies, over many different people, you're actually growing with the innovations and ideas of the whole society. Whereas if you're investing in debt, you're investing in the promises of the past. And that's why you get a different return, because you've got a different connection to your community. One is a connection based on a fixed promise. The other is a connection based on a shared hope.
Do you think that we're partly seeing the effects of almost too much quantitative easing over the last 15 years? You've had sort of remarkable events with the financial crisis and the pandemic. Bank of England and banks around the world took necessary action with that. But it is one of these things where we have seen a huge kind of inflation in asset prices, and it has really stretched that generational divide.
Yes, it has. And you're absolutely right. What quantitative easing has done is produce more bonds, effectively, so more debt. And then effectively, it has produced more ways of swallowing up that capital. So it has made it harder for people who are earning to keep up with those who have assets. Because, of course, the more you produce of something, fundamentally the price goes up, doesn't it? Right? One of the impacts of the price going up, of course, is that the value of the money relatively slips. We call that inflation. And that's what we've seen gently over the last many years.
Isn't that sort of so fundamentally unfair that those that are working have been outstripped by those that have just owned assets?
And that's why, when I talk about a conservative revolution, it's about reconnecting those. Because the truth is, there are several ways where the government can take your money, right? The most obvious way is in taxes, when they say, you bought this, you owe me 20%. Right? That's the obvious way. Yeah. Or you've been paid this, you owe me 35, 45, whatever it is, percent. The second way the government can take your money is it can just devalue the money in your pocket. And effectively, it can make things more expensive. Now, a little bit of inflation is important. That's why there's the 2% target. Because if you don't have any inflation, there's no incentive to do anything today. You might as well wait till tomorrow, right? Because it's going to be cheaper tomorrow, or it's not going to change. So you need a little bit of inflation to encourage people to act today. But when you get inflation rates that rise high, what you're doing effectively is you're making it harder for people to catch up, because wages very often lag asset prices.
And what do you think of when you think of the economy of the future and jobs of the future? Like, where do you think we need to be sort of positioning ourselves as a country?
Excuse me. Look, I mean, I think for me, a huge amount of the economy of the future is based on technology, of course. We've had various debates about how technology is changing. Well, I mean, your workspace here is an example of that. Frankly, we could be anywhere in the world and doing this. All you need is a pretty fast internet connection. And although we're sitting in the room together, we don't actually need to be. In many of the interviews you did during COVID, and actually since then, the other person has been quite literally the other side of the world. You don't need to be in the same place. And I think that's an area where we need to better understand what the implications are, because we're seeing people choosing different alternatives.
I wanted to let you know that last week we launched Boxlight, a creative studio to tell the stories of British business. I believe that lots of companies are going to build their own media and content arms. We're taking all the lessons that we have learned from creating Jimmy's Jobs of the Future over the last 4 years and helping businesses create their own insightful content. Whether it's going to be attracting potential employees, drive sales, or even persuade government, I believe this will be the new form of communication. I think there's a growing appetite for long-form content. If you want to get in touch with the team to see how we can work with you, check out our website at boxlight.io. That's boxlight.io.
But one of the things we do need to remember is that when you're talking about the future, you're still talking about these fundamental connections between people. And this is one of the ways where I think we've got to be aware of what these changing cultures mean. So it's harder, for example, it's much harder for young people to get the skills and training that they need, the softer skills, the softer training, if you see what I mean, that you get from working in an office if everybody's working from home. Yeah. Now, it's much easier for a 35, 40-year-old, 50-year-old to work from home than it is for a 20-year-old who's in a shared flat with 3 or 4 other people who are working different hours and all the rest of it. It's just harder. It just is. And it's also true that the 50-year-old has probably got the softer skills they're going to acquire.
Well, it's building that social capital, building
exactly
that
right.
social
That's
battery,
exactly
as
right.
it were. Yeah,
exactly right. That's part of the, the trick of society is the ability to hand down from old to young. That's what society does. It hands down skills, it hands down energy, it hands down talent from older to younger. Yeah. And when it works, that's how societies grow. And so that's part of the jobs of the future. The second bit is the simple reality that we are now competing in a way that, bluntly, we weren't when I left school. When I left school, or rather university in the 90s, the UK was competing against other European countries. So I was in a straight competition with other European 20-year-olds. I was in competition with some Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians and Americans. But that was largely it. Mm. Now when people leave school or university, they're in a straight competition with a bunch of Indian, Chinese, Brazilian, Nigerian people who may not even have to move to be in competition for that job. Yeah. Now that is a real change. And we need to think about what that means for how we train, how we skill, but also how we tax, how we invest to make sure that we're actually giving people the chance they need to succeed.
What do you think it means? How do we need to sort of train people? And, I guess partly coming back to that lifelong learning piece, right? Like in 10, 15 years, it's going to be hard. When your kids are entering the workforce, it's going to be hard to know now what they're going to need.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you'll remember it was, I can't remember when it was, 10, 15 years ago, the message was everybody needs to learn to code. Mm. Right, well, AI can do that for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so, not completely, of course. I don't want every coder to be writing it. The reality is coding is still a very important skill. But, a lot of these skills are in different ways being eroded. And a friend of mine who was very senior at one of the biggest tech firms used to say, if you don't know their name, their job will be done by AI. And he was saying that a number of years ago. And I think that's slightly oversimplifying, but you see the point that they're making, that if it's not a specifically human job, then technology will eventually replace the person doing it. Now, as I say, I think that's a bit negative, but the challenge is there. How do you prepare people? And that's where we've got to go away from the model that we've had and that I had. I don't know about you, where you go to this school until you're 18, you go to that university until you're 21. You may do a master's, you may not, and then good luck, goodbye. Yeah. The reality is actually the world is changing. And the need to retrain is getting greater. And that's why I'm hugely passionate about apprenticeships and rebalancing between apprenticeships and universities. Because actually, apprenticeships aren't just about your knowledge. They're about sharing the burden of training between the company and the individual. And that's a really important skill for our economy. Yeah. That shared commitment. And it comes back to my understanding of training from military service, right? You're constantly retraining, you're constantly rethinking what it is that you have to do. And that's not just on you as an individual, it's actually on your business. And so good apprenticeship schemes, and you see this, by the way, you see this in really strong apprenticeship cultures. Some of the bigger manufacturing firms, actually even some of the retail firms do this incredibly well. They invest very heavily in apprenticeships, and you think, oh, that's great. They're training, they're training young people who didn't get to go to university. No, they're not. They're training their entire business to be constantly a learning and adapting organisation, and that's where you see the real skill of apprenticeships coming through.
Yeah, no, it is amazing to see. What have you used AI for? You're quite a sort of.
I use it a lot.
Yeah, what do you?
I use different AI programs because they have slightly different skills actually, and they develop slightly differently. So you'll be using one, and then you'll realise that another one has leapt ahead a bit, and so you switch to the other one. I use them very often to draft the sort of technical paragraphs that you might need in a speech or an article. So, I'll ask it, what percentage of British growth in, the 1990s was connected to the coal industry or something. You've got to check, right? I mean, this is a very clear lesson. You have got to check the sources. Do not just assume that the information you've got is accurate. There are ghosts in the system, that it puts up mirages and hallucinations every now and again, or not every now and again, quite often actually.
Yeah.
But it is getting better, right? It is. I mean, it's noticeably getting better in the last 2 or 3 years. And what used to be various mirages is now pretty accurate. You've got to remember also there's a time lag. So for many of them, they're dealing with databases that are effectively a year or two old. So they're not actually up to date. But it's a really, depending on the program you use, it can be a very good way of getting a first draft or a series of ideas or a series of points out.
You ran in 2022 and running this year as well. Have you used much more AI for like designing websites and just the general nature of the campaign?
I haven't. As a candidate, there's only so much time in the day, and I've got a fantastic team. I'm really lucky, actually. I've got some exceptional people who have volunteered to help or who are on board. In fact, it's one of those things. As many MPs do, I've got my own website, obviously, and it's got sort of various email addresses that you can have attached to it. And of course, when the campaign started, I handed over control of that to the guy who's running my campaign, and we went from having 3 or 4 people, when it was about 5 email addresses on my thing, it was basically my team in Tunbridge, right, who helped with things, to having sort of 65 in like 2 minutes. People, and so the whole thing sort of exploded, and I'm very lucky. There's some really, truly exceptional people who are helping.
But it is one of the underrated skills of politics, actually, is team building. And obviously there's a big emphasis on it, because it's a strange job as a politician. You're partly lone wolf, but then also you need to kind of build coalitions and teams.
So it's much more, I mean, one of the things I did when I was still in the army, because one of the things being a single man in the army in the 2000s, and being deployed almost constantly for 7 or 8 years, I was able to save up a bit, and I did some very small amount, tiny amount of investing in startup businesses in the UK, and I got to know quite a lot of entrepreneurs, really, really early stage entrepreneurs. I mean, people who were, the first meeting was the 2 of us walking around a park because they didn't have an office, right? The office was, mum's second bedroom or something like that, right? And I helped a few of them start up. And one of the things that really strikes me is actually politics is quite like that. You're a one-man band at the beginning. You've got an idea, you've got some thoughts, and you need to be able to scale up when the moment comes, and try and ride that wave, if you like. And if you don't, somebody else will. But you also need to understand what it is you're doing. I mean, you've interviewed lots of entrepreneurs, and one of the mistakes that people make is either to be too fixed or not fixed enough on what they're trying to do. So if you're too fixed on a single design solution, when it doesn't work, you fall over.
Yeah.
But if you're not fixed enough on what you're trying to achieve, you end up spreading yourself so thin you achieve nothing.
Yeah.
And the same is true in politics. You've got to have, I would call it this, wouldn't I? Because of my military background, I call it having a mission. Right? Yeah. You've got to have a clear mission. Now, the mission may be achieved in many different ways, but you've got to know what it is that you're trying to achieve. In fact, one of the businesses that I supported early on, I mean, when it was literally just one person on his own, and I think I was his first investor. I may have been his second. His parents may have been his first. But, it was at that stage. He had a very clear idea of the thing he wanted to achieve. And he built a system to do it. Now, what he wanted to achieve I didn't think was ever particularly going to work, but I thought he was incredibly clever. And I thought he was one of those people who would always adapt. And what he did, of course, is when he couldn't, unsurprisingly, make the thing he was trying to achieve worked, he looked at what he had built and saw what else it could do. And he's since done exceptionally well for himself, because what he did was he took what he could do and adapted it. And that's a little bit what politics is about as well. It's work out what you're trying to achieve and what you've built and make sure that it serves the interests of the British people.
I'll ask you two sort of questions here that's sort of slightly split, but it's what characteristics are you looking for when hiring and sort of bringing people on board, I suppose? Let's just go with that first.
Well, I'm always looking for people who are cleverer than me, and you know, you're quite likely to look at me and say, well, that's not very difficult. True. But I'm always looking for people who've got drive and energy and imagination. And I think imagination is one of those things that's really hard, because I think imagination is a sign of intelligence. If you can think differently about a problem, if you can imagine yourself in a different situation, if you can place yourself in a different world, then it's a sign that you've got a form of mental agility that is a kind of cleverness. Now, there are many different kinds of cleverness, as you know. There's many people who have skills in 1,000 different ways. But imagination, I think, is a really important skill for politics, right? It's not an important skill for everything, but it's an important skill for politics, because the reality is about politics is that the situation is constantly changing. Yeah. And, you know, with variables that you simply can't factor in. You know, when we were elected in 2019, there were many people talking about what that meant for Brexit, what it meant for, 10 years of Conservative government under Boris Johnson, what it meant for, human rights or the rule of law or any number of different things. Nobody, literally nobody in December 2019 said, what does this mean for public health and pandemics and personal freedom in the UK? I mean, now, I'm not blaming anybody. Literally nobody thought, oh, we're going to have a once in a century global pandemic, and that's going to close down the economy for 2 years. I mean, that's not where we were. And so you need people in politics who can sort of understand that when things shift, you can adapt with them and think around a problem and consider differences.
And what's your advice for young people? You've had a really interesting and varied career. What's your advice for young people in terms of like just doing interesting things? Like, you've been journalist in Beirut, British Army, all these different things. You've always gone on and done stuff. Like, how do you do that?
Well, let's put this in context. I have had the luckiest start you could possibly have in life. I've had a family who's been incredibly supporting, which meant that I was able to take risks in ways that others may not have felt able to because of the responsibilities they had and the constraints, the natural constraints on their life. So I'm not a believer in telling people, do like me. Well, you may not have the same opportunities, you may not have the same thing, but I think the fundamental is, do things that interest you as much as possible. Now, that doesn't mean we all do things that are fantastic. I can tell you there were plenty of jobs I've done where I've wondered what the hell I was doing there at various points, as I'm sure you have. Yeah. And you spend, I remember actually I was a management consultant for about a year, and I realised after about a month that it really wasn't for me. And about 3-4 months in, one of the partners came to me, it was like 11 o'clock at night or something, and we were preparing for a presentation the next day. It was one of those moments where you're literally going through spreadsheets, checking ones and zeros. It was an utterly miserable moment. And this partner came up to me and said, oh, you're really good at this, but you'll be truly great when you develop the skills of an accountant. I went, oh, God. It was just... And it then took me about 6 or 7 months to find something else to do, right? I mean, I couldn't just walk out, but it's doing things that interest you, I think, is incredibly important.
One sort of final thing before a few quick fires. Going back to your old job of security minister, there's been challenges around MI5 and MI6 recruiting kind of in the modern world, with sort of lots of people having social media, etc. What are some reflections now that you've been slightly out of that in terms of what the security services sort of need to do, what they could do, and also, like, I grew up in a privileged background, but joining MI5 or MI6 never occurred to me in sort of distant Derbyshire. Like, what sort of needs to happen, sort of do a bit more of that?
Let me be.
I don't think I'd have been a very good spy.
Well, let me be cautious about how I answer this, because clearly I promised to keep the king's secrets, and I'm not going to start spreading them now. First of all, these are organisations like the Army or the NHS or any other business. They recruit from the British population. So the extraordinary thing about them is how ordinary they are, if you see what I mean. They're just another bunch of British people doing, a very special and very, very discreet job, but in some ways they're just another bunch of British people doing an important job. And there are many important jobs out there. This is one. That's the first point. The second is, you're right, the way in which people have a public profile today is different from the way it was, 30, 40 years ago. You can't hide in the same way. And so there are different skills, different ways of understanding the role and different ways in which you have to think about it. But the third thing is, these are really extraordinarily dedicated people. And the one thing that I'd say really stands out, I mean, above everything else, yes, they've got some pretty special skills, yes, they've got, remarkable sort of talents, but the one thing that really stands out is they are unbelievably ethically driven, really seriously ethically driven, because you're asking people to do things that in other contexts would be very, very morally troubling and sometimes possibly illegal. And so you need to have an ethical core that is very clear as to what's right and what's wrong. Now, I happen to think, I think defending the United Kingdom, protecting our liberties and protecting our people is a fundamental good, not just for us, by the way, but actually for the whole world. I think what the United Kingdom offers the British people, and indeed many of our partners and friends around the world, is an absolutely essential protection against dictatorships around the world. And I've been sanctioned by Russia and China and Iran. I've been targeted by all three in different ways because I've called them out because of the actions I've taken that I can't talk about. But the standing up against bullies and dictators means that sometimes you have to work with people who fall more into the grey than the black or the white. And if you don't know who you are, if you're not absolutely clear what's right and what's wrong, then you can rapidly see yourself drawn into the dark. Yeah. And so one of the things that I'm constantly impressed by intelligence and security officers in this country is how very clear ethics are to their role. And actually, the organisations themselves constantly reinforce it.
What would be your dream job? I obviously know you want to be Prime Minister, etc. But if you could do anything, what would it?
Well, the job I nearly did, and it's what you have those sliding doors moments. When I came back from Iraq, I was back on a farm helping a mate of mine lambing 1,000 ewes, and his shepherd quit in the middle of lambing season, and he offered me the job, and I thought about it really hard. Really thought about it very hard, and I very nearly accepted to be a shepherd for a few years, to do some writing on the side and journalism on the side. But it was, it's don't get me wrong, it's a really hard job, right? It's really demanding. But it's actually not hard all year round. It has some real moments of intense activity, and then you have a few months of sort of, easier stuff. So I really thought about it. I didn't go for it, though.
I love that. On a show called Jobs of the Future, that is probably one of the oldest jobs that exists, I think.
Sorry, Jimmy.
No, that's fine. Classic politician question, what's your favourite biscuit?
Oh, do you know, I just had one of those Biscoff ones, absolutely fantastic. Have you tried it? I hadn't had it before. I was always a big fan of the ginger cream, but these are like, sort of like cinnamony sort of thing, really good.
What would be your final meal?
You could choose. It's got to be fish fingers, mate. I love fish fingers. I mean, the only reason to have kids is so that you can steal fish fingers off them.
That's true. My fish finger intake has increased dramatically in the last 5 years. Who would you... Have you seen the show Celebrity Race Around the World?
Yeah.
Who from the Conservative Parliamentary Party would you most like to do?
You're really narrowing it down, aren't you? Look, I've got a lot of mates in it. Actually, do you know? Funny enough, do you know who'd be?
Who would you have the best time with, and who's the most organised? Right?
Those are very different things.
Exactly.
Do you know? Funny enough, I think I'd probably have the best time with James Cleverly. I think he'd be awesome. But that we wouldn't actually get very far. We'd get to the first bar, and then we'd lose. He'd still be telling stories and propping up the bar, and but he'd be very popular.
The budget would be gone on beer.
Yeah, exactly. But we'd get a lot of drinks bought for us because he's a natural raconteur. Who's the most organised? I don't know. There's some really impressive colleagues actually. I'm lucky actually. There's a lot of nice people, and actually, frankly, amongst the new intake, there's some really impressive people as well.
That's true. You haven't had a chance to get to know them. Who stood out so far?
For me, there's a few. Harriet Cross has been awesome. I mean, she's not only won a seat that the SNP thought they were going to win, but she's been absolutely awesome on the media. She's taken the fight to Labour, to the SNP, and communicating, conservative values in a really impressive way.
Who's your favourite Bond?
I'm still a Sean Connery fan.
Yeah. Do you think a new Bond should be a female?
I don't think it matters, actually. I think the new Bond should be whoever it is, but we need to up the role of M, I think, but not M as in the chief, M as in the minister who oversees it. Just saying.
Right. It's future casting.
I'm just saying, some of us, and by the way, I might be free in a few months.
You might have more time on your hands, but you might not. And what was the first thing you did to earn money?
I installed pay-per-view TVs in hotels. I spent months reaching around the sort of the ducts and the undergrounds or whatever, putting wiring into hotels in the days. So this nobody will understand this because everybody thinks the internet's the thing, but you had to pay for these TVs that had only a few channels. Do you remember?
Who's your favourite Tory Prime Minister?
Oh, I've got many. I mean, it's impossible not to go for Churchill in many ways, but actually one of the most interesting, I think, is still Disraeli, who really transformed the Conservative Party from a sort of, old school patrician movement to a national movement, and that's where the One Nation tradition comes from, bringing the country together and connecting generations.
What are your podcast listening habits?
So I am a complete sucker for The Rest is History, Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook. I almost never listen to politics because it's
day job.
Yeah, exactly. What else do I listen to? Oh, Conflicted with Eamon Dean. Do you listen to that? It's absolutely brilliant. Eamon Dean and Thomas, I can't remember his name, Thomas Small. They are absolutely brilliant. Eamon Dean is one of the bravest people you will never have heard of. He was in Al-Qaeda and he walked in to a British mission overseas and said, "I'd like to work for you." And he became one of our undercover agents inside Al-Qaeda. This is according to him, by the way. I could neither confirm nor deny, but this is what he says. And he is an absolutely extraordinary individual and well worth listening to. Has an extraordinary understanding of the Middle East and the motivations of various different terror groups and powers. Well worth listening to.
All right, well, we'll definitely check that out. On your desert island, what would be your luxury? And I'm going to give you a pause you can think here because I asked Nick Clegg this last week. And he said when he did Desert Islanders in 2010, it would be a packet of cigarettes. I said, would it still be that now? And he said, no, it'd be a packet of hobnobs. So what would be your luxury on Desert Islanders? I
mean, I'm assuming I get a bed and a pillow and things like that, right? Yeah, okay, fine, right. Otherwise, I don't know what it would be. Am I allowed a phone?
I'm not sure they'd allow that.
No, they wouldn't. No, I'd miss my kids too much, I have to say.
Yeah. All right, Tom, thanks very much.
Thanks.